مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يقول المثل إن استطلاعات الرأي مثل العطور جميلة الرائحة لكنها سامة عند شربها، ومع ذلك يتابعها المراشحون والصحفيون والخبراء السياسيون والمواطنون العاديون عن كذب كونها تقود الحملات الانتخابية. أظهرت أحداث استطلاعات الرأي الوطنية وجود سباق متساوي بين المرشحين، حيث حصل كل من دونالد ترامب وكامالا هاريس على 48% من الأصوات الوطنية. ولكن ما الذي تعنيه هذه الاستطلاعات حقا؟ كم هو عدد الأشخاص الذين يجيبون على استطلاعات الرأي ويصوتون في الانتخابات حقا؟ الأغنياء والفقراء، السود والبيض، سكان المدن والأرياف. هل يقول كل المشاركين الحقيقة؟ وهل تروي استطلاعات الرأي المحلية قصة مختلفة عن التي ترويها استطلاعات الرأي على مستوى الولاية؟ وإذا نظرنا إلى الوراء قليلا، فأي استطلاعات مدللة وأيها دقيقة؟ لمشاركة ما يتعلق بانتخاباتنا الرئاسية مع ملايين من الأشخاص في الشرق الأوسط الذين يقرؤون بشغف كل ما يصل إليهم، دعونا نلقي نظرة فاحصة على فن وعلم استطلاعات الرأي وما نتعلمه منها وما لا نتعلمه، وذلك مع نخبة من الخبراء راسل بيرمان وجوش كروشاور. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Polls. Polls dominate the election. But what do polls really tell us? And what don't they tell us?
Well, we are as poll obsessed as anyone is, especially with a few weeks before the election. What do those numbers mean, Rob? It means that we're looking at a very, very close presidential election. Some polls show Harris up by a little bit. Other polls show Trump up by a little bit. The battleground states where the race is going to be decided all show very, very close contests in the polling. The one thing we do know, this is going to be a close contest, but there's a margin of error in all these polls that even if Trump is up by a point or two or Harris is up by a point or two, we would consider that statistically tied. The big picture is what matters. We're looking at a very competitive election.
And when people read a national poll, given that in our country, the national popular vote doesn't really matter, we all know that Kamala Harris is going to get more votes overall than Donald Trump. Since it doesn't matter, should people even care about the national poll?
Well, yeah, it gives us a sense not just of where the horse race, where the race nationally stands, but these polls also show what the priorities of American voters are, how they view the candidates, why they may like Kamala Harris, why they may like Donald Trump, what they need to do to win over the undecided voters. And frankly, polls, we like to look at them to see who's up, who's down, but campaigns who spend a lot of money for their own polls often really want to look inside the numbers. It informs their strategy, their tactics, the kind of campaign they're going to run. So, the NBC poll, which is one of the best in the United States, really gives you a wealth of information about top issues on voters' minds, how they view the direction of the United States, and leading indicators of the trend lines in which the election is headed.
Help our viewers be good analysts and separate between polls that are useful and polls that are not useful. So, for example, should viewers care whether a poll is done by phone or done by in person? Should viewers care whether it's a poll of registered voters, likely voters, actual voters? How should people interpret some of these terms?
Well, there are different methodologies that different pollsters use. I personally think a registered voter, a sample of registered voters is a little more useful, because in our elections right now, in the modern election period, it's really hard to figure out who is going to vote. Voter turnout 20, 30 years ago in presidential elections was notably lower than it was in 2020, which was one of the highest levels of political turnout in American history. It going back almost, I think, about a century in the 2020 presidential election. So it's been coming. It's pollsters are having a hard time figuring out who is going to show up. Will there be a surge of Democratic or Republican turnout that isn't anticipated? So that I tend to prefer the polls that look at the broader voting pool rather than a likely voter model, which tries to use or really predict the types of voters that are going to show up based on their own responses. I also, when you look at polls, there's so many out there these days. There are a few that really I consider head and shoulders above the rest, and largely it's because the people doing the polling have experience doing live phone calls, and they have experience working in campaign politics, in electoral politics. So NBC's poll is done by two very well-known polling firms, one Republican, one Democratic, that has been working with NBC News for a long time. Fox News also has a collaboration between two top, one Republican, one Democratic pollster. The Wall Street Journal poll, also the person running that is someone who's steeped in doing polling for candidates and in electoral politics. So the one difference for me with those three polls and many of the others is that there's a lot of experience doing the work, measuring public opinion when it comes to campaigns. There are other polls that are fine, but they're a little less in depth when it comes to measuring public opinion for politics.
Now, when we look back at the last two presidential elections, it's tough to get polling Donald Trump correct. The polls seem to undercount Trump's likely outcome on election day. Why is that?
Well, it depends on, yes, in 2016 and 2020, the public polling dramatically undercounted the number of Trump voters that ultimately participated in the election. There are a lot of reasons speculated as to why that was the case. One major one is that a lot of people who are more liberal, who are college educated, like to answer they like to answer the phone, or when you get a text or a phone call or whatever, however you're reached. A lot of people who are a little more liberal, who are college educated, and many of those voters have become increasingly Democratic, increasingly liberal minded. They are Harris voters, and they like to respond whenever they're polled. Republican voters are perhaps a little more skeptical of when they get a phone call from a stranger, a little more perhaps skeptical of institutions and the kind of industry that does polling. So there was notably less response from some of these Trump voters that didn't participate in a whole lot of elections, but they did show up for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. That said, in the midterm election, in the last non-presidential election in 2022, the polls actually undercounted Democrats. So yes, in the last two presidential elections, there was a notable undercount among Trump voters. Pollsters have said that they've fixed their problems. They've adjusted their methodology. They've made changes into their secret sauce on how they conduct the polls. And we'll see. But there's also been evidence that in the non-presidential elections, the polling undercounted Democrats. So it's hard to kind of look at the past and automatically assume that the patterns of the last two presidential elections are going to repeat themselves in 2024.
And I know this is a bit of a sensitive question, but we do have, for the first time ever, a Black woman running for president. Sadly, there's probably a certain percentage, hopefully very, very small, that of Americans that just don't want to vote for a black woman, regardless of who she is. Will that show up in our polling? Will people vocalize this bias in a poll, or will it just get flushed away in the overall polling effort?
It is possible that some respondents don't want to tell a pollster their true views about Kamala Harris, though I will say that her, it's not like Kamala Harris had particularly strong favorability numbers. They've moved around as she's moved campaigned, and she was named the Democratic nominee. But I tend to think that especially now, voters are more comfortable asserting their support of Trump, or more comfortable offering criticism of Kamala Harris. She's been, frankly, widely critiqued, not just in the conservative press, but even in the mainstream media, from her, some challenges she faced as vice president on immigration, border security, and a number of other issues. So I don't think there's going to be a secret vote out there that from people that say they like Harris and ultimately aren't going to vote for her. We are a very divided country, Rob. It's for 50-50 America. This race is going to be decided on the margins, and people are really in their corners, and not a lot of undecideds or people hedging their bets with a few weeks out.
So let's take a look at what we'll get in this 50-50 America, what will bring us to a decision. There's a very short time before actual votes are being cast. In many places, votes are already being cast. I cast my ballot in the state of Maryland a couple of weeks ago. What, in the final days before an election, what is likely to turn a voter one way or the other? What key factors are out there?
This is an election that's been as much about what we call vibes, the kind of the mood, more than substance and policy. I think the big question for Vice President Harris is she has been a very progressive, liberal political figure throughout much of her career. She has tonally moved to the middle, moved to win over some moderates, even a handful of anti-Trump Republicans. But there's a lot of doubt that if she is elected president, she is going to be a moderate, that her record suggests she's much more attuned to progressive priorities. So there was one of the big cohort of undecided voters are people who I think they like Kamala Harris personally more. They would have a beer with her, perhaps more than they would with Donald Trump, but they have serious concerns and anxieties about where she stands on major issues, and she has not, in my view, alleviated those concerns, and she's going to have to do so in the final few weeks. She's talked about going on a conservative podcast with a very popular sort of right-wing figure in Joe Rogan. So there are signs that she understands she needs not just to win over her base to close the deal, but to win over people skeptical about where she stands and whether she's moderate and not too far to the left.
And in terms of Donald Trump, when Joe Biden left the election because of perceptions of age and declining ability to do the job, Donald Trump became the oldest person ever to be running for president, and what is heard a bubbling of concern about his own ability to do the job. Is that likely to be a rising issue in these final days before the vote?
Rob, age was the biggest factor in my view that kept voters from getting behind Joe Biden, and that's why he dropped out of the race. I don't think that's nearly as much the case with Donald Trump, even though he's not much younger than the current president. The biggest issue with Donald Trump is temperament, the perception that he's extreme, that he just is personally not the threat to democracy that is mentioned so often in polls. That's the worry that Donald Trump faces from a critical mass of voters. You look in the polls and you see people who actually like Trump's policies as president, at least during his first term, better than they like Joe Biden's policies. But there are a lot of those same voters that just don't view Trump favorably. They view him as not fit for office. And there is a critical mass. If Trump wins this election, there are going to be people that can't stand him personally, but think his policies are closer to where they stand on key issues. And that could be a decisive factor.
Yes. There's one of my friends says if you if you watch the Trump administration as a silent movie, if there's no audio, it's a lot better to watch it that way. All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to look at the final days before the election, look at whether issues like endorsements matter, and look at what the candidates are likely to say and do to win over that final margin of voters and to get up in the polls before November 5th. In just a moment. Again, my panelists today include Russell Berman. Russell is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers American politics. Formerly, Russell was a writer-producer for the venerable and often contentious McLaughlin Group on American television. And with us is Josh Kraushaar. Josh is editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider. Previously, he was managing editor for political coverage at the National Journal, executive editor of Hotline, and a political correspondent at Politico. Again, thank you both for joining me today. Glad to have Russell Berman joining our conversation with Josh Kraushaar. Russell, we've been talking about polls. Russell, do you have a favorite pollster, by the way?
Do I have a favorite pollster? I think the New York Times and Siena have done a great job. They offer a lot of analysis and explanation for their polls, which I think is helpful to kind of deconstruct the mystery around polling. Everybody loves Ann Selznick in Iowa, and she sometimes ventures out beyond Iowa. And she does a great job, but I'd probably go with the New York Times and Siena if I had to pick one.
And just to let our viewers know, where does that poll have the race as of today?
As of today, nationally, they had a poll that had Harris up by 3 to 4 points, which was a good poll for Harris, given that the New York Times and Siena, their polls overall have shown better results over the course of this presidential cycle for Donald Trump. They've had Donald Trump up pretty significantly in the Sun Belt states, in Arizona, Georgia, to a lesser extent in North Carolina. They had him up by something like 13 points in Florida, which even they acknowledge was probably an outlier. And that they've had the so-called blue wall Democratic states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin very tight. And showing, I think, a little bit of a lead for Harris in Pennsylvania. But they've shown a tight race, as have most of the polls.
Gentlemen, there's very little time left before the election. You want to get over the top, especially in the 7 battleground states. You're Donald Trump, you're Kamala Harris. What are you telling your campaigns? What's the most important thing? Are you reaching out to undecideds? Are you getting out your own vote? Are you talking to people in your coalition who seem less than enthusiastic? How are you spending your time? Josh?
Yes, and yes. I mean, all of the above in a race this close. Every constituency matters. I think it's key that Harris is reaching out to African-American men. That's become a big worry for the Harris campaign. And when you talk about the polls, there's been a consistent pattern in almost every high-quality poll that, especially among Black men, Donald Trump has made incremental but notable gains, given how key they are in so many of these swing states. So that's part of the Democratic base. She has been doing a lot of media, a lot of outreach these final few weeks. That is a concern for Democrats. But she also, as we just discussed, needs to win over these voters who like her more personally, but have serious qualms about where she stands ideologically. She's got Liz Cheney's endorsement, former Republican Congresswoman, very, very serious on foreign policy. Adam Kinzinger, another hawkish Republican former congressman. But she's I don't think that's enough. She has to reassure moderate voters, independent voters, that she is not the progressive she ran on in 2020 as a candidate for president, and she's learned and evolved in the 4 years since.
Russell, what is your view on how they're going to spend their final push? And do the endorsements, the types of endorsements that Josh just referred to, do they actually have an impact on voters? What's your view?
Well, it's interesting. Historically, endorsements have not had a huge impact on voters, but I referenced the Times poll. They did show more slippage by Trump among Republican voters, which could suggest that an endorsement as shocking as that of Liz Cheney and her father, Dick Cheney, might have broken through and achieved what the Harris campaign wants it to achieve, which is to sort of give moderate Republicans or old establishment type Republicans a permission slip to vote for her, that she is not this far left liberal that Republicans or Trump Republicans are making her out to be. If I was Harris, I would, similar to what Josh said, I would be focusing on these key cities, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, getting out young Black voters, particularly men, as Josh mentioned, also younger Latino voters, Asian voters, all of these voters that have been part of the Democratic coalition, but where turnout has slipped even in the last election that Joe Biden won in 2020. And for Trump, he needs the voters that only show up for Donald Trump. We've seen in the last few years that Democrats have done really well in lower turnout elections, which is a reverse from what we saw during the Obama era. And so Trump needs those rural voters, those white working class voters who might not have voted in the midterm elections. They don't vote in special elections as much, but he needs them to show up for him. And if there's any slippage that, some of the rallies that he's held that have not been quite as big or as well attended as in years past, if that is a canary in a coal mine of slippage among his base, I think we'll see that in the turnout on Election Day.
All right, so I have to take advantage of the fact that we have two very wise political observers to help our viewers abroad think about November 5th. First of all, how quickly are we going to know the outcome of the election? And put you on the spot, Russell, Josh, who's our victor going to be? Josh.
Well, I feel more comfortable predicting that we probably won't know the outcome on the Tuesday night of the election. There was just a case in Georgia where state election board officials wanted to hand count all the ballots, in addition to the more efficient process that the local counties typically do. It was actually overturned, but there's a lot of wrangling right now in some of these key states about vote counting. Pennsylvania, I think, is going to be a slow count state, and it probably is the most important battleground on the map. So I don't think in a few of the key states, Arizona's a vote by mail state. I think we're going to be waiting days to figure out who won these very, very close competitive contests. So I don't think we will have a call on Tuesday night. We may have to wait a day or two.
All right. Well, there we have it. Different views, sober, analytical view at our November 5th election. One thing everyone seems to agree is it might not be November 6th that we have a new president. It might be a couple of days. Hopefully not much longer than that, because I want to be able to explain all this to our viewers on Dakhel Washington. Thank you, Josh Kroshauer. Thank you, Russell Berman, for helping explain it to them today in the run-up to our big vote. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات على موضوع هذه الحلقة، وخاصة ما يتعلق بجودة أو سوء استخدام استطلاعات الرأي في انتخاباتنا الرئاسية، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.